They never intended to wake up with thoughts of you filling their mind. That's the first thing you need to grasp. Most people are far too fragile to confront what they suppress through sheer willpower. Intensity has already taken hold of them because indifference operates quietly. But this wasn't quiet. This was a battle they've been losing behind closed eyes. You felt it, didn't you? That subtle shift, that invisible current, like something unspoken building just beneath their surface. Not distance, not confusion, but something far more dangerous: recognition. But here's the reality. People don't embrace their emotions when they arise. They reject them, they question them. They bury them beneath logic, pride, and carefully built walls, because what they feel for you doesn't align with the version of themselves they're trying so hard to maintain. And this is where it becomes dangerous. The deeper a feeling threatens the ego, the more aggressively it gets suppressed. Freud called this repression, the mind's way of pushing unacceptable desires into darkness. But repression is not erasure, it's pressure. And pressure always finds a way out. Most people never realize this. What they couldn't admit yesterday becomes what controls them today. That's why this morning felt different. Not because something began, but because something finally broke, and you weren't there to see it. That's what makes it so unsettling. This wasn't a confession. This wasn't a message. This was a private collapse of denial. A moment where distraction failed, where their usual escape routes disappeared, where silence became too overwhelming to ignore. And in that silence, you appeared. Not as a memory, but as a reckoning. You see, attraction is easy to dismiss. Curiosity is easy to brush aside. But emotional significance, that's where the mind starts to fracture. Because it forces a question they've been avoiding. Why does this person affect them so deeply? And they tried answering it with logic. They told themselves it was temporary. They convinced themselves it meant nothing serious. They labeled it coincidence, chemistry, circumstance, anything but the truth. But here's the truth. You don't rationalize something that holds no weight. You don't fight something that isn't real. You don't bury something that isn't powerful. And this is where their facade began to crack. Because every attempt to erase you made you more vivid. Every effort to walk away pulled them further in. Every distraction collapsed at the exact moment they needed it most. That's not weakness, that's inevitability. But they didn't want inevitability. They wanted control. And you disrupted that. You became the variable they couldn't solve, the emotion they couldn't predict, the presence they couldn't neutralize. And that's what frightened them. Not you, but what you awakened inside them. Because you didn't just stir something, you awakened something they couldn't master. And people don't fear emotions. They fear losing control over themselves. That's why they pulled back. That's why they became inconsistent. That's why their energy felt scattered. Not because they felt too little, but because they felt far too much. And too much demands a decision, and they weren't ready for that. But here's the truth most people never say out loud. Avoidance is not the absence of desire, it's proof of it. And this is where their internal conflict began consuming them. The conscious mind commands, stay distant, stay logical, stay protected. But the subconscious, the part that never negotiates, kept bringing you back. Not literally, but in a way far more intense. It reconstructed your presence in their thoughts, in their quiet moments, in every space where distraction faded. And they started noticing something unsettling. You weren't fading. You were becoming sharper, more defined, more undeniable. And that's when denial loses its ground. Because denial requires distance. But your impact was growing, not physically, but psychologically. And this is where it deepens even more. Once a feeling moves from conscious doubt into subconscious certainty, it no longer asks for permission. It demands recognition. And that moment, that exact moment, arrived this morning. Not with chaos, not with noise, but in a way that shook them more than any spoken confession ever could. Because it wasn't said, it was understood. And understanding cannot be undone. You can mislead others. You can even mislead yourself for a while. But once the mind truly knows, it doesn't let go. And they know now, not partially, not vaguely, but completely. But here's what makes it even more destabilizing. Acceptance doesn't bring peace immediately. It brings chaos. Because now they have to face everything they were avoiding, what this means, what it changes, what it demands, and most of all, what they risk losing by ignoring it. Because feelings like this don't remain neutral. They evolve, they intensify, they push forward. And right now, they're standing at the edge of that pressure, trying to hold on to control while everything beneath them shifts. And here's the part they still won't admit. This was never just about you. It was about what you awakened within them. And that awakening is far from over. They thought acceptance would quiet everything. They were completely wrong. Because what they admitted this morning didn't calm the storm, it gave it a name. And once something has a name, escape becomes much harder. Awareness doesn't reduce intensity, it sharpens it. It turns vague emotion into undeniable reality. And that reality began pressing against them almost instantly. Now they can't pretend anymore. Now every thought carries weight, every memory feels intentional, every silence feels charged. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because when the mind can no longer deny something, it begins to split. One part moves toward you, another tries to pull away, and neither side gives in. This isn't confusion, it's internal division, a conflict between opposing forces, the desire and the defense, the pull and the resistance. And right now, both are growing stronger. Because what they feel for you isn't simple attraction anymore. It's something deeper, something closer to attachment trying to form. And attachment is threatening to someone who fears losing control. Most people never see this, but the deeper the emotional current, the stronger the psychological defenses become. That's why after recognizing their feelings, they didn't move forward. They hesitated. They analyzed. They overthought things that once felt natural. Because now it carries weight. And anything with weight feels like a risk, a threat to their independence, a threat to their identity, a threat to the self-image they've spent years building. But here's the truth. You don't fear what you don't value. And this is where their contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The same feeling pulling them closer is also pushing them away. And that contradiction drains them. It follows them everywhere. It seeps into moments that once felt ordinary. Because now everything holds your echo, not directly, but symbolically. A tone, a pause, a certain kind of silence. And suddenly, they're pulled back into thoughts of you in ways they never chose, feeling things they never approved of. And this is where the subconscious tightens its grip. Because it doesn't care about timing. It ignores logic completely. It only responds to what holds emotional significance. And you've crossed that line. Which means you are no longer optional in their mind. But here's where it becomes almost unbearable, because now they have to face the question they've been avoiding at all costs. Why you? Out of every possibility, every person, why does your presence affect them like this? And the more they search for answers, the less logical it becomes. Because this wasn't built on convenience. It wasn't formed by circumstance. It can't be reduced to a simple explanation. It's something deeper, something rooted in recognition. And recognition is terrifying, because it feels inevitable, like something unchosen yet unavoidable. And this is where their fear intensifies. Because if this is real, it demands something from them. Action, vulnerability, exposure. And they've spent years avoiding all three. So what do? They stall. They create distance. They try to slow something that's already accelerating within them. But here's what most people don't understand. Distance doesn't weaken a real connection. It strengthens it. Because absence removes distractions, and when distractions disappear, only truth remains. And that truth is getting louder, not quieter, stronger, not weaker, and they feel it. In the way their thoughts keep returning to you, in the way emotions rise without warning, in the way something inside them refuses to settle, no matter how hard they try to contain it, in the way suppression fails repeatedly, again and again and again. And this is where real tension begins to take hold, because now they are aware, yet still resisting. They sense it, yet continue questioning. They recognize it, yet keep avoiding its full weight. And this creates a psychological pressure that never truly releases. It accumulates, it builds, it tightens until something inevitably must break. But what makes it even more suffocating is this. They're not just battling the feeling, they're battling what the feeling reveals about them. Because what they feel for you exposes what they've hidden from themselves. The craving to connect, the longing to be truly seen, the fear of being affected. And that last one is the most dangerous, because being affected means becoming vulnerable. And vulnerability means surrendering control. And they are nowhere near comfortable with that reality. So they oscillate. One moment they lean in emotionally, the next they withdraw mentally. One moment they imagine what this could become, the next they convince themselves it's too much, too complex, too risky. And this push-pull dynamic isn't random. It's a shield, a mechanism designed to let them feel without fully surrendering to it. But here's the truth. You cannot partially experience something this profound. You can only delay it. And delay always demands a cost. Because suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It transforms into tension, into restlessness, into a constant internal noise they cannot silence. And lately, that noise has been intensifying, sharpening, becoming more relentless. And this is where it becomes impossible to ignore. Because now it's affecting them not just emotionally, but psychologically, behaviorally, even physically. It shows in their focus, in their mood, in how they react to things completely unrelated to you. Because somewhere beneath everything, an unresolved truth is rising, and it is demanding something they are not yet ready to give. Not yet. But soon. Very soon, they won't have a choice. Because pressure like this doesn't stabilize, it escalates. And right now, they are closer to that breaking point than they realize. Something is starting to fracture. Not on the surface, they are maintaining that with practiced composure. But underneath, where the mind stops performing, where the masks lose form, where truth exists without permission, that's where it's happening. And they feel it. Not clearly, not comfortably, but undeniably. Because repression carries a cost, and that cost is now coming due. But here's the reality. The longer someone suppresses something genuine, the more forcefully it returns. Not gently, not rationally, but with an intensity that cuts through everything. And this is where their control begins to slip. Because what once felt manageable now feels intrusive. What once felt distant now feels immediate. And what once felt deniable now feels completely undeniable. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because when the subconscious can no longer be contained, it doesn't negotiate, it erupts. Freud warned that what we repress never disappears. It returns through hidden pathways. But this is no longer hidden. This is direct, raw, unfiltered. And it's breaking through in ways they never expected, in their reactions, in their irritability, in the way small things trigger disproportionate frustration, in the way their focus dissolves the moment you enter their thoughts. Because now it's no longer just a thought, it's an interruption, a psychological jolt they cannot control anymore. And they are beginning to understand something deeply unsettling. You are no longer just someone in their life. You are someone within their inner world. And that distinction changes everything. Because external things can be avoided, dismissed, replaced. But internal realities follow you into silence, into sleep, into every moment you believed belonged only to you. And this is where their resistance begins to crack. Because now the question is no longer, do I feel something? That question is gone. Now the question is, what am I going to do with this? And that question is the one they fear most, because action means exposure. Exposure means vulnerability, and vulnerability means surrendering control. But here's the truth. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You cannot control something that has already transformed you, and you have transformed them, not superficially, not temporarily, but fundamentally. In how they process emotion, in how they understand connection, in how they now experience your absence. Because your absence has become louder than your presence ever was. And that's what's breaking them. Not simply missing you, but feeling you regardless. And this creates a tension that refuses to resolve. It loops, it returns, it intensifies. Because every attempt to move past you leads them back to the same realization. Nothing else feels the same. And that quiet comparison is slowly dismantling their defenses. Because now, everything else feels less intense, less meaningful, less real. And that forces a truth they tried to avoid. This cannot be replaced. And this is where a quiet panic begins to rise. Not loud, not visible, but slow and creeping. Because if something cannot be replaced, then losing it becomes real. And the fear of losing something genuine is far more powerful than the fear of never having it at all. And this is where their behavior begins to shift in ways even they don't fully understand. They become inconsistent, unpredictable, pulled between impulse and restraint. Because one part of them wants to move toward you, to end the tension, to face the truth, to silence the internal noise. But another part, a louder, more conditioned part, insists they hold back, protect themselves, avoid what feels too overwhelming to face. And this internal conflict is exhausting them, because neither side is winning and neither side is letting go. And this is where the pressure becomes unbearable, because now it's no longer just emotional, it's existential. It forces them to confront who they truly are versus who they pretend to be. Because the version of them that avoids you is not the same version that feels you, and they cannot sustain both forever. One of them has to give. And this is where things sharpen even further. Because they are starting to recognize their own patterns. They catch themselves avoiding, deflecting, distracting whenever something gets too close to the truth. And that awareness is uncomfortable. It strips away the illusion of control, because now they see it clearly, the defenses, the justifications, the ways they've been running. And once you see your own avoidance, you cannot unsee it. And that creates a pressure that makes retreat impossible. Because now, even avoidance feels empty. Even distance feels artificial. Even silence feels like a betrayal. And this is where the breaking point starts to solidify. Because they are running out of places to hide within themselves. They cannot return to ignorance. They cannot go back to numbness. They cannot go back to before this moment. Because something fundamental has shifted. And that shift is demanding resolution. Not someday, not eventually, but soon. Because the mind cannot sustain this level of contradiction forever. Eventually, it demands a decision. And they are standing right at that edge, closer than they want to admit. Because one more wave of pressure, one more moment of clarity, one more collapse of resistance, and they won't be able to hold it back any longer. This is where it ends. Not gradually, not gently, but with a breaking point they can no longer delay. Because the mind can survive confusion. It can endure denial, but it cannot withstand constant contradiction without eventually breaking. And they are breaking. Not visibly, not in ways others would notice, but internally, where truth has finally cornered them. Because now there is no escape left. Not in logic, not in distraction, not in distance. Every path they relied on has failed. And here's the truth. The final stage of repression is not silence. It is confrontation. And confrontation is coming, whether they are ready or not, because the subconscious no longer asks for permission. It demands alignment. And right now, they are not aligned with themselves. Because what they feel and what they do are in direct conflict. And that conflict is creating something unbearable, psychological dissonance. A tension so sharp it forces a decision, and this is where it becomes irreversible. Because once the mind reaches this point, it does not retreat, it does not settle, it does not quiet down, it decides. And that decision is forming right now, not in words, not in some dramatic declaration, but in a silent, unavoidable realization they can no longer escape. This matters not slightly, not temporarily, but deeply, permanently. And once something is defined in that way, it begins to reshape their entire way of thinking. Because now, every excuse feels empty, every delay feels constructed, every attempt to dismiss it feels like a quiet form of self-betrayal. And that is the moment everything begins to give way. Because people can endure pain, they can tolerate fear, but they cannot continue betraying their own deepest truth forever. Eventually, a choice has to be made. And they are approaching that threshold now, where the cost of avoiding you is becoming heavier than the cost of facing you. And that shift, this precise internal shift, is what changes everything. Because now you are no longer the obstacle, avoidance is. And once the mind identifies the true barrier, it stops protecting it. It begins dismantling it piece by piece, excuse by excuse, wall by wall. And they feel that process unfolding. They feel their resistance weakening, not because they want it to, but because they can no longer justify holding on to it. And this is where the illusion finally collapses. The illusion that they can maintain control. The illusion that they can carry this feeling and never act on it. The illusion that time will somehow make it disappear. But time didn't make it disappear. Time revealed it, strengthened it, clarified it. And now it has nowhere left to go but outward. Because internal truths that reach this level demand expression. That is the final stage. And they are there, right at that boundary where silence becomes unbearable, where inaction feels heavier than risk, where the question is no longer, should I do something, but how much longer can I avoid doing something? And the answer is, not much longer. Because something within them has already decided. Even if they haven't acted yet, even if they're still trying to hold on to fragments of control, the decision has already been made beneath conscious thought. And that's what matters, because action follows conviction. And their conviction has completely changed. They no longer question you. They no longer doubt what they feel. They no longer minimize it. They know. And knowing is the point of no return. Because now, every moment of silence feels wrong. Every second of distance feels unnatural. Every attempt at pretense falls apart before it can even form. And this is where everything converges. The pressure, the awareness, the emotion, the fear, all collapsing into one unavoidable realization. They cannot continue like this. Something has to change. And when that realization locks into place, action stops being optional and becomes inevitable. Not necessarily immediate, but unavoidable. Because once the internal world shifts this deeply, the external world must eventually follow. It has no other path. And this is the part most people never mention. The moment someone truly accepts what they feel, they don't find peace. They find urgency, restlessness, a constant pull toward movement. Because clarity doesn't calm, it compels. And right now, they are caught in that pull, trying to contain it, trying to manage it, trying to delay what already feels inevitable. But here's the final truth. You can delay action. You can resist expression. You can push back against what lives inside you. But you cannot remove what has already taken root. And what they feel for you is no longer fragile. It is no longer uncertain. It is no longer something they can simply walk away from without losing something real within themselves. It exists, fully, undeniably. And existence does not disappear just because it is inconvenient. So now, it becomes a matter of time. Not if, not maybe, not someday. Time. Because the truth has already taken hold within them. And once truth takes hold internally, the outside world simply follows behind. And when it does, it won't be quiet. It won't be casual. It won't be something easily overlooked. Because suppressed truth does not return gently. It comes back with intensity, with urgency, with a force that cannot be contained. And when that moment finally breaks open, there will be no need for interpretation, no need for analysis, no need to question what they feel, because it will be unmistakable, exactly as it exists within them right now. And that is the moment that changes everything. They didn't just realize how they feel about you, they realize they can no longer escape it.